Charlemagne's empire was forged by an army so powerful it reshaped the map of Europe, yet no one at the time recorded how that army was actually built. To understand the mystery behind it, we have to step back into a world on the brink of collapse. Before Europe had kings, crowns, or nations, there was only crisis. Rome was gone, its legions vanished, and the West splintered into dozens of warring tribes desperate to survive the vacuum left behind. But then, almost impossibly, an army emerged that could do what no other force had managed since the fall of the Caesars. It crushed kingdoms, besieged stone fortresses, absorbed entire peoples, and carved out an empire so vast that it rivaled the Byzantine and Abbasid giants. And at its head stood a single towering figure, Charlemagne. But here's the twist, and the mystery that has haunted historians for almost 2 centuries. We still don't truly know how his army worked. That's the paradox. Charlemagne built the first super army of post-Roman Europe, a war machine capable of decade-long campaigns across thousands of miles. Yet the system behind it, how men were recruited, equipped, trained, and commanded, is still shrouded, contradictory, and fiercely debated by modern scholars. What survived from his era are fragments, annals written by monks, letters from advisors like Einhard, and capitularies copied and recopied generations later. From these scraps, historians have built competing theories that disagree on almost every fundamental point. Were Charlemagne's armies elite mounted warbands bound by loyalty, or mass levies built through compulsory service, or a Roman-style military bureaucracy revived in a new age? Each model explains a different piece of the puzzle, and each collapses when stretched too far. And that is where our story begins, not with certainty, but with questions. Because if we can understand what made the Carolingian military function, we can understand how Charlemagne unified half of continental Europe, and how his empire became the blueprint for medieval power. Imagine the world Charlemagne inherited. The 8th century was one of violent flux. Saxons raided the northeast, Lombards threatened Italy, Avars pushed from the Danube, and Muslim forces pressed north from Spain. Every frontier was a battlefield, every border a wound waiting to reopen. Yet the Franks did not break under pressure. They expanded. They conquered the Aquitanians. They toppled the Lombard kingdom. They smashed the Avar Khaganate and dragged home its legendary treasure. They defeated Bavarians, Bretons, Frisians, and countless Slavic tribes. This wasn't luck. This wasn't chaos. This was an army that knew what it was doing. This was strategy, logistics, coordination, a kind of order Europe had not seen for 300 years. By the early 9th century, Charlemagne commanded the largest and most effective military force in the West. Contemporary chroniclers describe armies that seemed endless, columns of infantry, contingents of armored cavalry, wagon trains of siege gear, and marching camps so organized that some scholars call them proto-Roman. Yet the deeper we dig, the stranger things become, because the sources that describe this mighty machine contradict each other. The annals tell us what the armies achieved, but never clearly how they were built. The letters of Einhard, Charlemagne's advisor and biographer, praise the emperor's leadership, but avoid explaining the mechanics of recruitment. And the capitularies, the famous decrees issued by Carolingian rulers, don't survive in their original form at all. Everything we have are later copies, compiled with other unrelated texts, their dates and contexts often uncertain. In other words, our best evidence is a jigsaw puzzle, missing half its pieces. And yet from this incomplete record, historians once believed they had the whole story. For much of the 19th and early 20th century, scholars assumed the Carolingian army was built on Germanic universal service, a straightforward model in which all free men owed military duty. It seemed simple, logical, continuous with classical descriptions of early Germanic societies. But then the 1990s hit, and almost everything changed. The feudal interpretation collapsed. The universal levy fell apart. New methods of reading medieval documents emerged, and with them a wave of theories that clashed violently with one another. Today, 3 major models dominate the debate, each using the same evidence, but drawing radically different conclusions. The warband model sees the army as elite aristocratic cavalry, bound by gift-giving and personal loyalty. The conscription model sees a semi-Roman system of compulsory service tied to land ownership. The patron-client model reduces the entire structure to networks of obligation between local elites and the king. Each theory solves some problems and creates new ones. Each offers clarity and raises more questions. Which brings us to the core challenge of understanding the Carolingian military. It wasn't a fixed system at all. It evolved, it adapted. It changed depending on campaign goals, geography, politics, the wealth of local elites and the shifting priorities of the king. Charlemagne didn't inherit a military machine. He built one out of older traditions, Germanic warbands, Roman administrative culture, Christian moral authority, and the raw ambition of a dynasty on the rise. And if we trace how this machine shifted over time, a clearer image appears, not a single structure, but a hybrid. Not one army, but many armies woven together. A network capable of overwhelming enemies through flexibility rather than uniformity. But before we can get to those models, and the explosive debates they sparked, we need to understand one more crucial point. Everything we think we know about the Carolingian army comes from a handful of capitularies, texts that were not law codes but rather notes from royal councils, copied decades after the fact. These documents do not present a complete system. They offer glimpses, a requirement here, a penalty there, a rule for landholders, a guideline for equipment. Scholars must read between the lines. They must ask, was this rule universal or local? Was it a reform or a reminder? Was it enforced or aspirational? Charlemagne's military power existed. The records of his conquests are undeniable. The empire he built survives in the political DNA of Europe. But the internal engine of his army, the machinery that made conquest possible, remains maddeningly elusive. The strongest empire of early medieval Europe was built on a military system we still struggle to define. That uncertainty isn't a footnote. It's a battlefield. Because as soon as historians realized that the Carolingian military machine didn't fit neatly into any simple model, three competing visions emerged, each claiming to reveal the true engine behind Charlemagne's conquests. And each of these visions doesn't just interpret the sources differently, it reshapes our entire understanding of power, loyalty, and warfare in the post-Roman world. Some see a tightly knit community of elite warriors. Others envision a revived echo of Roman bureaucracy. Still others picture a living web of local obligations and negotiated loyalties. What each model attempts to answer is the same question: how did Charlemagne mobilize, equip, and command armies capable of conquering half the continent? The struggle to answer that question is not just academic, it's emotional. Because behind the theories lies a larger theme: whether Charlemagne's empire was held together by discipline, charisma, or fragile human relationships held at the edge of collapse. And the first model in this debate looks nothing like a structured empire at all. In one interpretation, the Carolingian army was not a mass of conscripted peasants, but a hierarchy of elite mounted warriors grouped around powerful magnates. This vision argues that military service was less about obligation and more about opportunity, a world where young noblemen fought their way up the social ladder through courage, loyalty, and proximity to powerful leaders. At the core of this system was the personal bond. A magnate, whether a count, bishop, abbot, or royal favorite, held a circle of followers who were tied to him through sworn loyalty, gifts, shared meals, and the expectation of gaining land or status. These weren't primitive bands of raiders, they were aristocratic companies, trained, armed, and ready to ride out whenever their leader called. In this world, war was the proving ground of rank. Every campaign was a chance to earn honor. Every victory was a doorway to privilege. Gift-giving formed the arteries of this system. Horses, weapons, gold, estates, ceremonial clothing, even positions at court. Through these gifts, the leader fed loyalty, and the follower returned military service. If this model is correct, then Charlemagne's military power came not from organizational genius, but from the gravitational pull of his dynasty. The Carolingian court, overflowing with wealth seized from expansion, became the center of an orbiting universe of ambitious warriors. And yet, this model creates a paradox. A system built on small elite circles can explain elite cavalry. It can explain why the aristocracy fought so fiercely to stay close to Charlemagne. But it can't easily explain the scale of the empire's campaigns, the sieges, the long expeditions, the enormous marching columns, or the need for thousands of infantry and support personnel. If the Frankish military depended mostly on elite warbands, then who operated the siege engines? Who guarded supply lines? Who held fortified positions deep in enemy territory? The The warband vision explains a part of the army, but not the whole of it. And so another vision rises to challenge it. The second interpretation argues almost the opposite. Instead of warbands orbiting powerful nobles, this model sees a structured, coordinated military system that represents a continuation of late Roman administrative practices. According to this perspective, Charlemagne's empire functioned through layered obligations connected to land ownership. Communities provided labor to maintain fortifications and infrastructure. Free landholders equipped themselves or pooled resources to outfit one warrior. Larger estates supported heavily armed cavalry. Expeditionary forces were drawn systematically from these networks, forming a massive and predictable recruitment pool. Under this vision, war wasn't a personalized ritual, it was a national duty. Rules concerning equipment, transport animals, armor, and penalties were not symbolic reminders, but part of a larger structure designed to produce a steady flow of manpower. Royal estates scattered across the empire stored food, fodder, and supplies, forming supply corridors that made long-distance campaigns possible. In this model, Charlemagne's army looks surprisingly modern: planned campaigns, predictable recruitment, organized logistics, and commanders trained in classical military theory. But this interpretation also runs into obstacles. The documents we rely on aren't legal codes in the Roman sense, they're fragmentary directives, not fully codified systems. Many obligations described in them seem local or situational, rather than universal. And the idea of permanent drilled household troops is attractive, but the sources never explain such a unit directly. The conscription model explains the scale of the army, but risks imposing too much order on a world still shaped by personal relationships and regional variations. So scholars turn to the third vision, a middle path that accepts the complexity rather than fighting it. The third model argues that the Carolingian army was neither a Roman revival nor an aristocratic warrior society. Instead, it was a fluid, decentralized network built on local alliances and practical necessity. Under this vision, freemen served not because a distant king compelled them, but because they were tied to local elites. The people who protected them, gave them opportunities, and mediated their relationship with royal authority. Magnates didn't command because the king made them do so, they commanded because their communities recognized their authority. When the king called for war, he didn't issue demands down a chain of command, he negotiated with regional power holders, who in turn mobilized their dependents. This explains why Carolingian military organization seems so inconsistent. It changed from region to region, it relied on unwritten expectations, it was flexible, adaptive, and deeply human. This model paints Charlemagne not as a master organizer, but as a master negotiator. His power depended on his ability to persuade, reward, and bind elite supporters into cooperation. When these networks worked together, the Carolingian army surged forward like a tidal wave. When they pulled apart, as they eventually would, the empire cracked. But even this model leaves us asking the same burning question. If the Carolingian military was so fluid, so dependent on negotiation, how did Charlemagne maintain authority strong enough to wage decades-long campaigns across thousands of miles? That answer lies in the documents that survive, the capitularies, those fragile, copied, edited fragments of royal intent. And what they reveal is not uniformity, but something far more unsettling. In the next section, we open those documents and uncover the rules, obligations, punishments, and expectations that formed the skeleton of the Carolingian war machine. And once we examine the texts themselves, we come face to face with a truth that challenges all three models and reshapes our understanding of Charlemagne's power. What ultimately held this war machine together wasn't sheer force, noble loyalty, or Roman discipline. It was something far more intricate, hidden within the very rules and expectations of Carolingian society. Once those obligations come into focus, the entire military structure looks different, and each of the three models begins to crack under the weight of what the evidence actually demands. Once we step away from theories and turn toward the surviving evidence, the world of the Carolingian military becomes stranger, more fragile, and far more revealing than any single scholarly model suggests. Because the documents that should explain Charlemagne's military system, the capitularies, don't behave like law codes. They weren't crafted as formal legal frameworks or universal rules for an empire. They were living documents, shaped by negotiation, circumstance, and local politics, written down only because the kingdom was too vast to trust memory alone. Most importantly, none of them survive in their original form. Every capitulary we have is a copy of a copy, preserved in collections assembled decades after Charlemagne's reign. Some were excerpted, others were edited, a few were merged or reorganized by scribes who had no intention of preserving context. What we're left with are fragments, rules pulled out of their original setting, preserved alongside unrelated texts, sometimes without clear dates or authorship. Yet within these imperfect documents lies the closest thing we have to the machinery that powered Carolingian warfare. They are not blueprints, they are not manuals, they are more like moments, glimpses into the inner workings of a kingdom trying to keep itself from fracturing under the weight of its own strength. And those glimpses reveal three things with absolute clarity. Military duty was tied to land, service was expected, and consequences were severe. That's the skeleton around which everything else moved. The capitularies reveal a system in which military service was not equal, it was proportional. The more land you held, the more you owed. For heavily armed cavalry, land ownership wasn't a bonus, it was the price of admission. Wealthier freemen were expected to equip themselves with mail, weaponry, shields, horses, and supplies. Those with moderate property often pooled resources with neighbors, forming service groups capable of sending one fully armed warrior to fulfill their collective obligation. This didn't come from a universal legal tradition. It came from necessity. The empire was vast, and the cost of war was rising. Cavalry equipment was expensive, campaigns dragged on for months at a time. Someone had to carry the burden, and it was placed squarely on those with the means to bear it. But here's where the system becomes more intricate. The capitularies show that even poorer freemen, those with almost nothing, were not exempt from duty. They might not ride into battle, but they were expected to contribute through labor, transport, and infrastructure work. They repaired fortifications, they carried supplies, they helped maintain roads and river crossings. Their service wasn't glamorous, but it was indispensable. Without these men, Charlemagne's sieges wouldn't have moved, his campaigns wouldn't have lasted, and his logistics would have collapsed. The Carolingian army wasn't built on equality, it was built on the careful distribution of responsibility. The most striking feature of the capitularies is not what they require, it's what they threaten. Skipping service wasn't a small offense, it was a public betrayal. The penalty, often called the harabanus, could reach sums that would ruin an average landholder. These fines weren't symbolic, they were designed to make refusal nearly impossible. And that tells us something crucial. Military service was not universally embraced. People needed to be compelled, they needed pressure. In some cases, they needed fear, not because they lacked loyalty to the king, but because military campaigns were devastatingly expensive. A man who went to war risked losing his harvest, his land, his tools, and even his family's survival. The capitularies show a government trying to balance its need for manpower with the reality that the empire's stability depended on not pushing its subjects too far. This tension forms a pattern. Service was expected, but compliance was not guaranteed. It's a reminder that Charlemagne's power, though immense, was never absolute. He governed through influence, negotiation, and the strategic use of coercion. One of the most revealing aspects of the capitularies is their silence. They never present a fully formed system, they never lay out the military structure in clean Roman fashion. They never define the relationship between different types of service. Instead, they respond to problems. They adjust, they clarify, they reinforce. What emerges is a kingdom in motion, one constantly adapting to threats on every frontier. There were years when external enemies pushed harder, years when internal stability faltered, years when the cost of war outpaced the willingness of freemen to shoulder it. The capitularies shift in tone accordingly, sometimes demanding more, sometimes stabilizing expectations, sometimes calling for defensive mobilization, sometimes preparing for long-distance campaigns. This fluidity mirrors the competing models historians debate today. If the documents seem inconsistent, it's because the empire itself was inconsistent. Charlemagne wasn't creating a perfect machine. He was managing a living organism. For all their value, the capitularies reveal just as much through their omissions as their content. They never describe a central standing army. They never outline permanent household troops. They never map a clear hierarchy of command. They never present a universal levy in the modern sense. Instead, they reveal a patchwork of obligations, some local, some regional, some tied to personal relationships, some tied directly to royal authority. A man's military role depended on where he lived, who he owed allegiance to, what land he held, and what expectations existed in his community. What looks like disorder is actually distributed responsibility, and that is what makes the Carolingian military system so difficult to pin down. It wasn't one thing. It was many things working together, imperfectly, unevenly, but effectively enough to conquer an empire stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe. As the capitularies reveal these layers of obligation, a new picture begins to form, one where war wasn't just an act of violence, but the center of political identity. For freemen, military service wasn't merely a requirement, it was their tie to the very idea of the empire. It was what defined them as part of something larger, something beyond the limits of their local village or estate. But beneath this grand vision lies something much more fragile, a system dependent on cooperation that could never be fully guaranteed. If magnates separated from the king, if freemen refused service, if local networks broke down, the entire war machine could collapse in an instant. And there were moments, quiet hints in the documents, subtle anxieties that suggest this system came closer to breaking than most realize. Because for all the structure we can glimpse in these records, there is one final question the capitularies cannot answer. How did Charlemagne keep this sprawling, inconsistent system unified under his rule? The answer lies not in the documents, but in the human relationships that stood behind them, and in the delicate balance of power that was beginning, slowly to slip. If the capitularies expose the bones of the Carolingian military system, its obligations, penalties, and expectations, then the lived reality of military mobilization lies not in royal documents, but in the local world that made those documents meaningful. Because no matter how many rules Charlemagne issued, no king could enforce military duty across an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Danube purely through written commands, not when distances were vast, communication slow, and regional identities stronger than any distant notion of empire. To understand how the Carolingian war machine actually moved, we must descend from the halls of royal administration into the patchwork of estates, villages, monasteries, and lordships where real authority existed. Here in the rhythms of daily life is where armies were raised, not in the palace, but in the social ties of the countryside. The Carolingian military system functioned only because local powerholders made it function. These magnates, counts, abbots, bishops, and great landowners were not passive servants of the king. They were the pivots on which the entire military structure turned. They controlled resources, land, dependence, and networks of obligation that stretched outward like roots across the soil of the empire. And when war came, it was through these roots that the king's commands traveled. Charlemagne's edicts could demand service, but only magnates could turn those demands into marching soldiers. They acted as the king's conduits, intermediaries capable of mobilizing dozens, sometimes hundreds of dependents. These regional leaders didn't follow orders simply because they were written. They followed because they benefited. Service meant influence, influence meant rewards, rewards meant land, and land meant more dependence, creating an ever-expanding circle of power. In this sense, magnates were not merely administrators, they were political brokers. When a campaign was called, they weighed their relationships, measured their resources, and made decisions that affected the mobilization of entire communities. Their cooperation meant strength. Their hesitation could weaken an entire frontier. This distribution of power explains why the army could be enormous one year and smaller the next. It explains why service patterns varied so dramatically between regions. It explains why commands needed reinforcement, and why penalties were sometimes severe. And it reveals the heartbeat of the Carolingian military system. The empire moved when its magnates moved, but magnates weren't the only force shaping the army. Beneath them were the freemen. Freemen were the empire's essential middle layer, neither aristocrats nor unfree laborers, but legally independent men who held land, owed service, and formed the backbone of the military levy. Their rights were tied to their responsibilities, and their responsibilities were tied to their social identity. Military service was one of the few ways a freeman engaged directly with the idea of the Carolingian realm. To participate in the army was to acknowledge the king's authority, to refuse service was to risk losing not only property but status, to fall from the ranks of those counted among the free. Yet their relationship to the king was distant, their relationship to their local patron, their senior, was immediate. A freeman might never meet the king, but he depended daily on a local magnate for protection, mediation, justice, or opportunity. When that magnate answered the king's call to war, the freeman followed. This relationship wasn't feudal, not in the later medieval sense. There were no knights sworn by rigid oaths of vassalage, no codified categories of service. Instead, the bond was personal and practical. A freeman might rely on a magnate because his father had, or because the magnate owned the mill he used, or because the magnate controlled the land he farmed, or because the magnate had supported him in a dispute. These connections weren't written in law, they were woven into life. Because these relationships differed across the empire, the army itself was a reflection of regional diversity. In some areas, magnates commanded well-equipped cavalry elites. In others, they raised infantry levies or local militias trained to defend town walls. Border regions often produced hardened militias, accustomed to quick mobilization against raids. Interior regions contributed logistical support or slower-moving infantry. This unevenness wasn't a flaw, it was strategic flexibility. When Charlemagne planned a campaign, he wasn't pulling from a single uniform pool of soldiers, he was assembling a mosaic. Each region contributed what it was best suited to offer. Some brought engineers experienced in siegecraft, others brought riverboats and supplies, others contributed elite mounted warriors capable of rapid movement. The result was an army that could adapt to different terrains and challenges. Siege warfare in Italy required different manpower than campaigning across the Saxon forests. Raids along the Danube demanded mobility, while defending the Atlantic coastline required fortified positions and local vigilance. The Carolingian system succeeded because it didn't try to impose uniformity. It allowed the empire's diversity to become its strength. But diversity also meant vulnerability. The deeper one studies this system, the clearer its fragility becomes. Everything depended on personal relationships, those between magnates and the king, freemen and their patrons, communities and their leaders. If a magnate refused to mobilize his dependents, the king's writ stopped cold. If freemen resisted their duties, a region's contribution collapsed. If local obligations shifted, the entire military rhythm faltered. Charlemagne was able to command this complicated web because he possessed extraordinary personal authority. He was a ruler who won battles, distributed wealth, and commanded loyalty across generations. While he lived, the system held because he was its center of gravity. But that raises a dangerous question. What happens to a system built on personal bonds when the person holding it together leaves the stage? What happens when magnates grow more powerful than the king they serve? What happens when land becomes so concentrated that freemen struggle to maintain their standing? What happens when personal loyalty can no longer be guaranteed through victory and reward? These pressures were already whispering beneath the surface during Charlemagne's late reign. The documents hint at growing strain, at the need to reinforce obligations, redefine expectations, and reassert control. The engine that had propelled Carolingian expansion was beginning to overheat. And while Charlemagne's authority was strong enough to keep the system from breaking, there were cracks forming, cracks that would widen dramatically in the decades after his death. Because the most important truth about Charlemagne's army is not how it was built, but how easily it could come undone, and it would take only one moment of political weakness for the entire structure to begin unraveling. Charlemagne's military system was never carved into stone. It was a living creation, part Roman memory, part Germanic tradition, part political negotiation, and part sheer force of personality. It conquered kingdoms, broke fortresses, and stitched together a realm larger than anything Western Europe had seen since the legions marched. But it did so by balancing on a knife's edge, held together by obligations that were always shifting, loyalties that were never guaranteed, and elite networks that could just as easily divide as unite. For a generation that balance held. Under Charlemagne, the army marched across frontiers with precision and confidence, an instrument shaped by a single will. But once he was gone, the tensions he contained began to move. Magnates grew more powerful. Freemen lost ground. Local identities hardened, and the delicate webs of obligation that once formed the backbone of imperial strength slowly, steadily began to snap. The Carolingian Empire did not collapse because its armies weakened overnight. It collapsed because the relationships that made those armies possible, relationships built on trust, pressure, and shared ambition, began to erode. The system was brilliant, but it depended on one thing no institution can guarantee: unity of purpose. In the centuries that followed, Europe would fracture again. Power would shift into castles and counties. Loyalties would become personal and territorial. The great sweeping campaigns of the Carolingians would fade into memory. But the legacy of Charlemagne's war machine endured, in law, in landholding practices, in military expectations, and in the idea that the people of Europe could belong to something greater than the stretch of land they stood on. A system built on fragile bonds had forged an empire, and even in its collapse, it left behind the foundations of medieval Europe. What Charlemagne accomplished remains astonishing, a military structure so vast and so adaptive that even today we struggle to define it. Yet perhaps that is the lesson. Power in the early Middle Ages wasn't found in perfect systems. It was found in people, imperfect, ambitious, loyal, fearful, and driven by forces no document could fully capture. And in the end, that is the real story of Charlemagne's army. Not a system, not a structure, but a world. If you enjoyed unraveling the hidden machinery behind Charlemagne's empire, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Tell me in the comments, which model of the Carolingian military makes the most sense to you and why? Also, what should the next video be about? Do you want a deep dive into Louis the Pious, the Saxon Wars, the Ava collapse, or the rise of medieval cavalry? Your insights help fuel the next episode. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is never just about what happened, it's about what it meant. I'll see you in the next one.